So I'm back today with some dark fiction reviews, and while some of these books are straight up horror or thrillers, some of them are not. These are the kind of books that I was reluctant to review on my channel last year because I worried that they didn't count as horror or thrillers, so I didn't feel like they were valid books for me to talk about. But a lot of times these are books that I really love. They tend to involve dark themes in general, but maybe aren't traditional books that fit into certain genres. So I've decided this year to give myself a lot more allowance to just talk about the books that I'm loving and reading, and hopefully you all will go along for the ride even if they don't quite fit into certain genre boxes. All that being said, let's get started. So let's start with the safer picks, the books that definitely fit into the horror genre. So the first book I want to talk about is A House with Good Bones by Kingfisher. This is a new release. I received a copy for review from Tor Nightfire, and in this story we follow a woman who is returning back to her family home. It used to be her grandma's home and now her mother is living there. She has a complicated relationship with the women in her life, and her mother is just acting strangely. She herself has an interesting career. She works with bugs, and that is infused within the story. So if you kind of love some creepy crawly talk, that is really fun. I have read Kingfisher's books before, and I will say, similar to what I've said before, the fact that her books, in my opinion, are very light in tone. They're almost very jokey and read very contemporary. And so while I appreciate what she's doing, they don't entirely work for me because I do prefer a darker, more serious narrative. But of all of her backlist books that I've read, this one worked the best. I should mention that while I have a physical review copy, I did get a chance to check out the audiobook, which is narrated by Mary Robinette-Quall, who is one of my favorite all-time narrators, and I do think that her performance really uplifted the work. So if you are an audiobook listener, I do recommend checking it out that way. In the story, I like that you delve into her past. It's very traditional, where she recounts and remembers her childhood. She has a difficult relationship with her grandmother. She herself is in a larger body, and so she dealt with a lot of fat shaming and fat phobia by her grandmother that she had to deal with and deconstruct as an adult. And now her mother is starting to exhibit some strange behavior that kind of is reminiscent of the grandmother. And so you really start to wonder what is happening. The book hints at certain things, but I will say that it was a bit more unpredictable than I expected. So I thought I knew exactly where it was going, and it took a little bit of a left turn. I think some of you, depending on the tropes that you love, are going to really enjoy this one. I thought the humor was on point and overall really fun. So again, her books are pretty much never going to be 5-star reads as long as she continues to write the way that she does. But this one is definitely entertaining. If you love her work, this will probably be your new favorite. Highly recommend to her fans. Next, let's talk about a mystery, and that is Scorch Grace, which follows a woman who is a nun, and the school that she works at starts to be targeted for arson. So there is someone setting things on fire. The police, of course, get involved, but she herself is not really satisfied by the investigation, and so she decides herself to take it on and proceed to try to find out who is behind it all. This is the book I wanted to pick up because while I don't read a ton of mysteries these days, it's because most of them just tend to be the same thing over and over again. And in this case, this one felt really fresh or interesting because the fact that the main character is not only a Catholic nun, but she is identifying as queer, and she also is a heavy smoker and just is very non-conventional for what you typically think of as a nun. This is both the thing that I love so much about the book and also my struggle. And that is the fact that my own experience within the Catholic Church, I could just not imagine someone like that living within the confines of the rules and being satisfied within the nun life because of the fact that there is so much queer phobia and all of that. Now, in terms of the story, you get a lot of flashbacks to her past because that is really how you get to see the queer representation. You get to see that she was involved with another woman and how that fell out. She is still someone who really pushes the edges when it comes to how she lives her life, but again, really falls within the beliefs of the church. So I just really liked her as a character, but I found it unbelievable only based off my own understanding and experience within the church. So I'd love to know perhaps if someone maybe is a nun in a place like New York that's a lot more progressive, maybe these individuals do exist within the church. So I like this one. I will admit that I thought the mystery was really interesting at the beginning, but as the story progressed, I became less interested in that. The story has a ton of flashbacks, as I mentioned, and I found those to be some of the most interesting parts. If you are someone who just wants to get to the mystery, you might find those parts more frustrating, but I like them. So overall, I'd recommend this book, but you have to be willing to read a book that is very focused around a nun in a church, and it's just kind of a strange combination of a lot of things that don't normally fit together. So I liked it, but didn't entirely love it. Next, let's talk about a new translated thriller, and that is Red Queen. This is a book that has just come out here in North America in English, and within the story there is a boy, a young man who has been brutally killed. He's the son of a very rich family, and the way that he has been killed seems very ritualistic, so they bring in a full investigation team. Within the story, it's told from two perspectives. We have that of the police officer who's investigating. He is someone who has really been disgraced within his field and is using this as an opportunity to get back in their good graces. And then the story is also told from the perspective of what I'd call a consultant. So there is this young woman, Antonia, who basically stays by herself. She is in this apartment and does not leave for the most part, but she's also a brilliant criminologist mind, and so she is pulled in for her expertise. Now, this is a book, if you can't tell from that synopsis, is being marketed as the next Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And while I'm always incredibly wary of those comparisons, I will admit that in a lot of ways this does fit the bill. So you have a pairing of an older man who is more an investigation professional and someone who is not, but this younger woman, and she is definitely a little bit like Elizabeth. She's very snarky, she is very smart, and the main police officer, I'll say, reminds me of Bloomkiss, only because I found Bloomkiss to be really boring and annoying, which is also how I describe this guy. As for the story itself, I thought it was fine. I will admit that these kind of police procedural thrillers are not my favorite genre, so if you really love them, you may love them more. I definitely do prefer A Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. I'd reluctantly say that if you really love that book and are looking for something similar, this one might scratch the same itch, but I just don't think it's up to the same caliber. I thought the mystery was okay. I thought the main character, Antonia, was good, but not as good as Elizabeth, so keep that all in mind if you decide to pick it up. It was fun, but I'll be honest, as a reviewer, this book was crazy overhyped. I've been hearing about this book since I believe July of 2022, and unfortunately it just got kind of blown up in the review circles that I live in, and it just wasn't as special as all the marketers made it out to be. Next is Ghoul by Brian Keene, and this is a straight up coming of age horror story that is set in the 1980s. We follow a group of young boys who are playing near a graveyard. They see something and possibly see a ghoul there. Of course, the adults in the neighborhood don't really believe them and they have to deal with everything themselves. I will say it's a very traditional story. It does have some dark moments to it. I liked it, but because I've read so much coming of age stories in the past few years, many of which have become my favorites, I thought this one was good, but there are a lot more I would recommend before this one. So I would say it's a good one if you've read everything else, but it's kind of average if I'm honest. I didn't feel a lot of a nostalgic pull for that decade or time period, and I felt like the author kind of made some cheap references where they tried to pull the audience in if they understood a certain reference to a comic book or a TV show, but actually what they should do is create an atmosphere of nostalgia so that the reader doesn't actually have to have a connection to that time period in order to have that same reading experience, because I've read books that are set way before I was born that I feel far more nostalgic reading than this one, if that makes sense. Next, let's talk about one of these books that doesn't really count as horror. It's not really a thriller, but is really dark. I really loved it, and I think that a lot of you, if you share my taste in books, will like it too. And that book is Chlorine by Jade, and this is a new release that I recently read. I came across. I feel like it's still pretty underhyped, and I'm hoping to change that. This is a female coming of age story that follows a woman, actually a few women, who are competitive swimmers. One of the characters is queer, and you have her experience within the team that she is on, and you also get the challenges that come with just growing up. Particularly the one girl is of Chinese descent. Her father has immigrated from there and actually has immigrated back to China, and so you have this woman who is struggling where she is pulled between two cultures. She has her family pressures and her friend pressures, and then of course she is trying to compete at a very high level at this sport. So there is trigger warnings for self-harm, for eating disorders, and just a lot of trouble troubling things that do affect a lot of young people, female or otherwise. And so within the story, you follow this character as they are going through their daily grind. They are trying to form relationships, friendships, and other romantic partners, and just all the terrible things that happen to them. I'm reluctant to call this one a thriller just because typically I would expect there to be a mystery at the center of the story. And as you can tell by my vague synopsis, instead we really just spend time with the character as they deal with the various aspects of their life. And it just has some really dark themes surrounding it, but there isn't exactly like a murder that's about to happen. And so you can probably guess that this author reminds me a lot of Megan Abbott, another author that I really like. She also writes competitive female sports stories, and so it gave me vibes of her work. So if you love things like Dare Me, this one is one you might want to check out as a comparison. And overall, I was just drawn to the story. What I love so much about it is what I describe as it being fierce feminist fiction. So you have a really gritty story told in a very strange way. It's very literary in nature, and that's kind of where the book sort of segues into horror, but not quite, in the way that they describe themselves as mermaids. So they almost become fish within the water, and that's where you as a reader kind of have to sparse out, is this supernatural or is this a literary metaphor? And I don't really want to spoil it because I think that readers can get different things out of this book, especially how you feel towards the ending. But it's just this cutting, beautiful prose style. It's lovely, but lovely in a dark way, like really dark things are happening. And I remember thinking, wow, this book is really beautiful how it's written, even though terrible things are happening to the main character. So if you can't tell, this is easily one of my favorite new releases this year. It's so different than the things that I normally read. As you can tell from this video, I read a lot of tropey fiction, and so reading something that feels different and yes, still has its own tropes, because coming of age stories are filled with their own tropes, but this one worked in a different way because it felt very fierce and unflinching and all the things that I love, especially when a female author does not hold back and is not afraid to write complicated characters. And that's exactly what you're going to get here. So if you want characters that are going to be imperfect, make terrible choices, and have terrible things happen to them, this is a book you want to check out. I love it, highly recommend it, and I hope you read it for yourself. And finally, let's talk about The Story of Junk, which is a literary novel that follows a woman who is addicted to heroin. Right at the beginning of the story, in the first chapter, the police show up at her place and they come in, they know that she is an addict, and they pressure her to turn in her friends and give up her dope, and the story spirals from there. The story recounts what happens afterwards, but it also gives us the backstory about how she became a drug addict, and I gotta admit, the story fascinated me. To give more background, I should mention that I'm not someone who actually reads a lot of fiction or nonfiction related to drugs. It's just not a topic I really enjoy spending my time with, even though it is important as a larger society topic. But within stories, I often find that they're written, whether they're fiction or otherwise, in a very stream of consciousness style that I find to be very frustrating. I understand it makes sense for someone who is on drugs to be writing in that way, but I don't find it very enjoyable to read. So that's why this story really stood out to me, is the fact that the prose are beautiful. Who am I? I used to never care about prose, but suddenly I care so much about good writing and writing that I really connect with. So I really felt like the author took their time to fully flesh out a story for a reader like myself who is not otherwise interested in the topic, and really draw you in, because I was immediately pulled into the story. I cared very deeply for this young woman. She didn't just feel like a stereotypical drug user. Instead, she was an actual human being, a person, which worked really well within the story to make me care for her. And then the story itself was very compelling, and the author in the after really explains that they do this on purpose to really try to rid some of the stigma surrounding drug use, and to realize that people of all walks of life fall into these bad habits, and that things spiral from there, and just create a really nuanced, morally gray, complex story, which is what I'm looking for. So I'll be honest, I'm not going to go on a big binge of just reading a whole bunch of drug books, because I don't think that the subgenre really appeals to me. But a book like this is one that I would recommend even if you, like me, don't read a lot of drug fiction, because it really subverts the topic and just has some really compelling messaging. So overall, I ended up really liking this one. I'll have to admit, I must have Googled 5 times to confirm that this is a novel, because it really read like a memoir in places, and I was so terrified that I was going to call a novel a memoir. So Hopefully I'm not wrong, but I do believe it's a work of fiction. I don't know how closely the author is tied to the subject matter of this work, but if you want a beautiful story that handles a very difficult topic in a very nuanced and beautiful, fascinating way that really adds complexity to the conversation, this is the one to read. Again, I'm not going to read 100 other heroine memoirs, but this one, if you're only going to read one, this is it. It was so well done. Highly recommend. So that is it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know how you feel about me going rogue with these videos and talking about dark fiction books that don't necessarily fall neatly within the boxes of horror and thrillers. I've mentioned this before, but I really hope that you all will buy in to the fact that if I'm reading and reviewing books that I love, I think it's a win-win for all of us. And these are books that I just honestly enjoyed, even if they don't technically count as certain types of dark fiction. So let me know if you're coming along for the ride. If you're new here, I hope you're subscribed. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things that I enjoy. And if you want to help me out, you can give this video a thumbs up. You can drop an emoticon like a mermaid for Chlorine. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.